There are moments in sports where history gets made, and then there are moments where history gets ripped away. Aliyah Wilson thought she had just secured her legacy forever. 3 years, $5 million, the biggest contract the WNBA had ever seen. She celebrated it, posted it, owned it. For a brief moment, she was untouchable. But what she didn't know, what nobody warned her about, was that the entire league was about to shift under her feet. Because while Wilson was celebrating, Indiana was planning, quietly, ruthlessly, and less than 48 hours later, everything collapsed. Aliyah Boston didn't just sign a contract. She detonated the entire system. For years, $6.3 million, a number so big, it didn't just pass Wilson, it erased her. And just like that, the crown was gone. No build-up, no warning, no respect for timing, just gone. And the worst part, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a takeover. Because behind Boston, standing silently, watching everything unfold, was Caitlin Clark, next in line, next to break the system again, next to take everything. And suddenly, this wasn't about contracts anymore. This wasn't about money. This was about power, about control, about who really owns the future of the WNBA. Because one player thought she had reached the top, only to realize she wasn't even standing on stable ground. And what happened next is where everything truly exploded. Long before the contracts, before the headlines, before the numbers exploded into chaos, Aliyah Wilson was a standard, not just a star. The star, MVP after MVP, finals runs, championship expectations, a presence so dominant that the league didn't just respect her, it revolved around her. For years, if you talked about power in the WNBA, you were talking about Aliyah Wilson. She wasn't chasing validation. She was the validation. Every endorsement, every spotlight, every big moment, it all pointed back to her. And she knew it. That confidence didn't come from nowhere. It came from carrying the weight of a league that was still fighting for attention, from being the face when the cameras weren't always there, from building a reputation brick by brick, season after season, without shortcuts. But something started to change. Slow at first, almost invisible. A new energy, a new audience, a new type of attention that didn't follow the old rules. And it didn't center around her. It started with Caitlin Clark, a player who didn't just play the game. She bent it. Deep threes, sold-out arenas, viewership numbers exploding overnight. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about who was the best. It was about who people were watching. And that shift, that subtle, uncomfortable shift, it hit harder than any loss. Because dominance on the court was no longer enough. Now there was something else, something bigger, something harder to control. Attention. And then came Indiana. Not loud, not chaotic, but calculated. Because while other teams were chasing moments, Indiana was building a future. They drafted Aliyah Boston, quietly dominant, efficient, disciplined, the kind of player who doesn't scream for attention, but commands it anyway. And piece by piece, they started building something different. Not just a team, a system, a culture, a vision. One where no single player stood above everything else. One where success was shared, balanced, strategic, and that stood in direct contrast to everything Wilson represented. Because in Vegas, the system revolved around her. The contracts, the expectations, the sacrifices, teammates adjusting, numbers bending, everything aligning to keep her at the top. And for a long time, it worked. But cracks were forming. Subtle, unspoken, but real. Because while Wilson was carrying the identity of a franchise, Indiana was creating something that didn't rely on one person. And then the league itself changed. Quietly, dangerously. The new CBA, buried clauses, rules that most people ignored, until it was too late. Because one specific rule, one overlooked provision, was about to flip everything upside down. And the players it was designed for weren't veterans, weren't established faces. It was built for the new generation. Players like Aliyah Boston, players like Caitlin Clark. And suddenly, all those years of dominance, all that control, all that power Wilson had built, was about to be challenged by something she couldn't stop. Because this wasn't a rivalry. This wasn't a bad game. This wasn't even personal. This was structural. The league itself was evolving, and it wasn't waiting for anyone, not even her. And when that reality finally hit, it didn't come slowly. It came all at once, and it hit like a shockwave. Because the moment Aliyah Boston signed that contract, everything Aliyah Wilson thought was secure started slipping away. The moment Aliyah Wilson signed that deal, she believed it was over. The grind, the debate, the constant fight for recognition. Done. 3 years. $5 million. The biggest contract in WNBA history. Not just money. Validation. Proof that everything she had built finally paid off. And she didn't hesitate. She let the world know. Social media lit up. Interviews echoed it. The message was clear. She was still on top. Still the standard. Still untouchable. But behind the scenes, something was already moving. Quietly. Precisely. And far more dangerous than anything Wilson expected. Because while Vegas was celebrating, Indiana was calculating. They weren't reacting to Wilson's deal. They were waiting for their moment. And that moment came faster than anyone could process. The epic provision. A rule buried deep inside, and the way it happened, that's what made it worse. Because Boston didn't chase her, didn't challenge her, didn't even acknowledge her. She simply moved past her. Like it was inevitable. Like it was always going to happen. And suddenly, the celebration turned into confusion. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not this fast. Not this easily. Not to someone like her. And then came the realization. This wasn't just bad timing. This was a system failure. Because Wilson's deal was built on the old rules. The old structure. The old way of doing things. And Boston, she was operating in the new world. A world where time didn't matter. Where hierarchy didn't matter. Where results came fast. And rewards came even faster. And that gap between old and new, is where everything broke. Because Wilson didn't just lose the record. She lost control of the timeline. And that's something you can't fix. You can't outplay it. You can't outwork it. You can't even see it coming. Until it's already happened. And just when it felt like things couldn't get worse, they did. Because Boston didn't just sign a bigger deal. She structured it differently. Smarter. More dangerous. She took less money up front. On purpose. Left space for her teammates. Kept the roster intact. Built something bigger than herself. And that's when the comparison became unavoidable. 2 stars. 2 contracts. 2 completely different mindsets. One focused on securing the top spot. The other focused on building a dynasty. And the league noticed. Fans noticed. Players noticed. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about philosophy. About leadership. About what winning actually looks like. And for the first time in a long time, Aliyah Wilson wasn't setting the standard. She was reacting to it. Trying to understand it. Trying to catch up to it. And that shift, that subtle but brutal shift, that's what started the tension. Because when you've been on top for so long, you don't just lose gracefully. You question it. You resist it. You feel it. Every comment, every comparison, every headline. And then, the final realization hit. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Because Boston might have taken the record, but she wasn't the one everyone was truly waiting for. There was someone else. Someone bigger. Someone louder without even speaking. Someone who hadn't even signed her deal yet, but was already looming over everything. Caitlin Clark. And when her moment comes, this entire situation, it won't just repeat. It'll explode. And that's when the real pressure begins. And just when Aliyah Wilson thought the damage had already been done, it got worse. Because losing the record was one thing. But what came next? That felt personal. Because people didn't just move on. They started comparing. Loudly. Relentlessly. And the narrative shifted overnight. It wasn't Aliyah got past. It became, why does Indiana feel different? And that question, that's what started the real chaos. Because when you looked closer, this wasn't just about Boston's contract. It was about how she got it, how she handled it, and what it meant. Because Boston didn't celebrate like she just won. She didn't flex, didn't take victory laps, didn't make it about herself. Instead, she did something that made the entire league pause. She took less money up front, On purpose. $1 million in year one. Way below what she could have demanded. And that decision, it changed everything. Because that move wasn't about her. It was about the team. It kept Kelsey Mitchell. It preserved depth. It protected the system. And suddenly, the contract wasn't just bigger. It was smarter, more dangerous, more complete. And now the comparison became brutal. Because on one side, you had Wilson, top-heavy deal, teammates sacrificing, a structure built to keep one player at the top. And on the other side, you had Boston, sacrificing short-term money to build something that could dominate long-term. And fans noticed, analysts noticed, even players started whispering, because this wasn't just a financial move. This was a statement about leadership, about priorities, about what winning actually looks like. And that's when the pressure on Wilson exploded, because now, it wasn't just about losing a record, it was about losing the narrative. And that's something far harder to control, because everywhere she looked, the conversation was shifting. Social media flooded with comparisons. Team first versus self first. Future versus past. System versus star. And whether it was fair or not, the damage was already done, because perception in this league moves faster than truth. And once that narrative takes hold, it doesn't let go. But then came the moment, the second twist, the one that turned tension into full-blown panic. Because this wasn't just about Boston. Boston was just step one. Step two was already waiting. Caitlin Clark. And suddenly, everything made sense. Because Boston's deal wasn't the end game. It was preparation, a setup, a foundation for something even bigger. Because they were reacting. And that's when everything spilled into the open. Not quietly, not respectfully, but violently, across social media, locker rooms, and every corner of the basketball world. Because the moment Boston's contract went public, the internet exploded. Fans didn't just react. They picked sides. One side screaming that Aliyah Wilson had been disrespected, that a four-time MVP shouldn't be passed that easily, that the league was moving too fast, too reckless, too eager to replace its own foundation. But the other side, they didn't hesitate. They called it evolution. They called it overdue. They said this was exactly what the league needed. A shift, a reset, a new era led by players who understood more than just dominance. They understood direction. And right in the middle of that chaos, every move Wilson made started getting dissected. Every post, every interview, every subtle reaction. Because now people weren't just watching her. They were analyzing her, looking for signs, frustration, jealousy, pressure. And it didn't take long for the narrative to turn sharp. Because suddenly, everything she had said in the past started resurfacing. Comments about recognition, about respect, about who deserves what in this league. And now those same words, they were being used against her. Twisted, reframed, amplified. Because now the question wasn't, is Aliyah Wilson the best? It became, is Aliyah Wilson being replaced? And that question hit hard. Because even inside the league, the energy shifted. Players started talking, quietly at first, then louder. Because what Boston and Indiana were doing, it wasn't normal. It was strategic, calculated, almost surgical. And it exposed something uncomfortable, that some teams were still operating in the past, while others had already moved into the future. And that gap, it was growing fast. Then came the fans, and they didn't hold back. Comparisons flooded timelines. Boston versus Wilson, Indiana versus Vegas, team culture versus star power. And every time the conversation leaned one way, it pushed Wilson further into a corner she wasn't used to being in. Because for years, she controlled the narrative. Now, she was reacting to it, and reacting late. And then, the most dangerous layer of all began to surface. Caitlin Clark. Because as all this chaos unfolded, her name kept appearing. In every debate, in every projection, in every what happens next conversation. And that made everything worse. Because now this wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what was coming. And what was coming felt inevitable. Because Clark wasn't just expected to break the record. She was expected to shatter it and take the spotlight with it. Completely. And that looming presence, that silent pressure, it changed everything. Because now Wilson wasn't just dealing with one moment of being past. She was staring at a future where she might not even be in the conversation anymore. And that kind of pressure, it doesn't stay external. It seeps in, into confidence, into mindset, into every decision. Because when the world starts questioning your position, you start questioning it too. And that's when things get dangerous. Because this isn't just about contracts anymore. It's about identity, legacy, control. And right now, all three are under attack. Because the league didn't just react to Boston's deal. It exposed something much bigger, something deeper, something far more uncomfortable. A shift in power that no one could ignore anymore. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't escalate any further, the final twist started to unfold. And this one changes everything. And just when it looked like this was about contracts, egos, and headlines, the real truth finally hit. This was never about Aliyah Wilson versus Aliyah Boston. That was just the surface, the distraction, the story everyone could understand. Because underneath all of it, something much bigger was happening. A complete shift in power inside the WNBA. And the scariest part? It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, calculated, and already in motion. Because while Wilson was reacting, and Boston was rising, Caitlin Clark was positioning. Not arguing, not complaining, not even engaging, just waiting. Because her moment hasn't even arrived yet, and she's already controlling the direction of the league. That's the twist nobody wants to say out loud. Because Boston breaking the record? That wasn't the end. That was preparation. A setup for something even bigger. Because when Clark becomes eligible, this entire system is going to break again. And this time, there won't be any debate. No questions. No arguments. Because her impact isn't just statistical. It's economic, cultural, global. She doesn't just influence games. She changes value. And when a player like that signs a contract, it doesn't just break records. It resets them completely. And suddenly, everything starts to make sense. Why Indiana structured Boston's deal the way they did. Why they protected cap space. Why they kept the core together. Because they're not building for now. They're building for what's coming. And what's coming is a moment that could put two of the biggest contracts in WNBA history on the same team at the same time. That's never happened before. Not even close. And if it does, it won't just be dominance. It'll be control. Control of talent. Control of... So I want your real opinion. Is this still Aliyah Wilson's league? Or has it already become Caitlin Clark's? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, raw, intense, and ahead of everyone else, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next move, it's coming soon. And when it hits, this entire situation is going to explode again.